You won't believe what happened after Eleanor Whitmore uncovered a sealed suitcase in her grandmother's attic. Inside were decades-old photographs of people no one ever spoke about, and a letter that shattered everything she thought she knew about her family. What followed unraveled a forbidden love, a missing mother, and a dark secret buried beneath the ruins of an old school. What would you do if the truth meant rewriting your family's entire history? Welcome to our YouTube channel. Before diving into this extraordinary tale, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. Your support helps us bring you more haunting, emotional stories that linger long after they end. Now, let's uncover the long-buried truth behind the attic photographs and the woman the world tried to erase. The rain tapped a soft rhythm against the window panes as Eleanor Whitmore stepped cautiously into her grandmother's old house for the first time since the funeral. The place smelled of lavender and cedar, the scent so familiar it caught in her throat and nearly brought tears to her eyes. It had been nearly 15 years since she'd last visited, and in that time the house had turned into a shrine of the past, untouched, dust-covered, and echoing with silence. She moved from room to room, brushing her fingers along the surfaces of antique furniture, trying to reconnect with memories that seemed just out of reach. Her grandmother, Lydia, had always been a private woman, kind, generous, but with an unspoken sorrow behind her eyes that Eleanor had only begun to understand as a child. The will had left the house to Eleanor, with a single instruction: look in the attic. It had struck her as odd, almost ominous, but Eleanor couldn't ignore it. Not after the way Lydia had whispered her name before passing, with a strange urgency that seemed to beg for something more than mourning. That afternoon, armed with a flashlight and a sense of mounting curiosity, she climbed the creaky staircase that led to the attic. The door protested with a low groan as she pushed it open, revealing a shadowy room cloaked in dust and cobwebs. Old trunks, yellowing boxes, and faded furniture crowded the space like ghosts waiting to be remembered. She sneezed as dust bloomed into the air, the beam of her flashlight dancing across the aged wood floor until it landed on a weathered leather suitcase tucked behind a rocking chair. Unlike the other items in the attic, this case had been covered with a plastic sheet, as if protected deliberately. Something about it called to her. There was a stillness in the air that felt like holding one's breath. Kneeling beside it, Eleanor unclasped the metal latches and opened the lid slowly, the hinges creaking with the effort. Inside, bundled carefully in linen cloth, were dozens of black and white photographs, their edges frayed and corners soft with age. She picked up the top photo, its surface glossy and cold despite the warm air of the attic, and froze. The picture showed a young woman standing beside a man in uniform, both smiling, yet something about their expressions felt strange, almost staged. Eleanor didn't recognize the couple, and there were no notes or names on the back. She sifted through more images. Children standing before a fireplace that wasn't in the current house, women in veils, men in formal wear, snapshots of a life she hadn't known existed. One envelope at the bottom caught her attention. It was sealed and bore her grandmother's elegant handwriting. For Eleanor. The truth. Her heart pounded as she slit the envelope open and pulled out a folded letter. The ink was slightly smudged, the writing old-fashioned yet precise. It began simply: My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then the time has come to understand who we really are. The words sent a chill down her spine. The letter continued, referencing names she didn't know, events she'd never heard mentioned, and hints of a family history that had been deliberately hidden. It spoke of a girl named Alice, of a betrayal, of a disappearance. Eleanor's eyes darted back to the photographs, suddenly seeing them not as relics but as evidence. Why had her grandmother hidden these? Why now? The storm outside grew heavier, thunder rumbling low as if echoing her thoughts. Her pulse quickened as the attic around her seemed to close in, each shadow stretching longer. The sense of mystery became suffocating, like something had been waiting all these years for her to arrive and uncover it. She turned over another photo and gasped. There, unmistakably, was her own mother as a child, standing beside a woman Eleanor had never seen before. This wasn't just about long-lost relatives. This was personal. This was about her. Her identity, her lineage, her sense of belonging, all thrown into question by a handful of photographs and a letter written in secret. Eleanor's grip tightened on the photo, the edges digging into her palm. Who was Alice? What had her grandmother hidden, and why? Her instincts told her that whatever had been buried in the attic had only just begun to reveal itself. She didn't know it yet, but the next steps would shatter everything she thought she knew. The attic, once a forgotten space, had become a portal into the shadows of her family's past. The photographs weren't just memories, they were clues. And Eleanor was no longer just a descendant. She was now an investigator of truth. The wind howled against the roof, rattling the windows as if trying to warn her to stop. But she wouldn't. Not now. The past had chosen her, and she was ready to answer its call. Eleanor sat cross-legged on the attic floor. Photographs fanned out around her like tarot cards, each one whispering a fragment of the past. She picked up the one with her mother as a child, studying the woman beside her, the mysterious figure who appeared in at least half the photos. Unlike Lydia, who always looked poised and distant, this woman had a warmth to her, a kind of mischief tucked in the corners of her smile. Eleanor could tell she was the kind of person who made others feel seen, who drew laughter out of silence. But who was she? There was no name on any photo, no labels, no scribbles on the backs to anchor the images in place. The same woman appeared again and again, always with someone from Eleanor's family, always in the background, at a picnic on a porch, holding a baby Eleanor suspected might be her Uncle James. Yet no one in the family had ever mentioned her. Not once. Not even when Lydia told stories about the old days over tea. Determined to learn more, Eleanor took the photographs downstairs and began cross-referencing them with family albums stored in the living room cabinet. She flipped through pages until her hands began to tremble. Not because of what she saw, but because of what she didn't. The mystery woman was completely absent from every official family album, even when the same events, like the porch gathering or a family trip to the coast, were clearly captured. It was as if someone had gone out of their way to erase her. Eleanor checked the dates handwritten in Lydia's neat script. 1952, 1955, 1958. Years before her mother was even born. She pulled out her phone, snapped digital copies of the photographs, and began reverse image searching and scanning them through photo recognition apps, hoping to match a face with a name. Nothing came up. No archives, no public records. She felt as though she were chasing a ghost. That evening, Eleanor video called her mother, Patricia, who lived across the country. "Mom," she began carefully. "Do you know someone named Alice?" There was a pause, a sharp, loaded silence that said more than any word could. "Where did you hear that name?" Patricia asked, her voice suddenly rigid. Eleanor hesitated. "Grandma left me a letter. And photos." Her mother's face paled on the screen, lips tightening as if she were physically holding something back. "We don't talk about Alice," Patricia finally said. "We never have. And we never will." Then she hung up. The abruptness left Eleanor stunned. It wasn't like her mother to shut down like that, at least not without good reason. The name echoed in her mind, Alice. It felt ancient and intimate at once, a name soaked in sorrow. That night, Eleanor lay awake on the living room couch, the photographs arranged beside her like puzzle pieces she hadn't yet assembled. She stared at the ceiling fan as it spun slowly, each rotation marking another question unanswered. Who was Alice to her grandmother? To her mother? Was she family? A friend? A threat? She got up and retrieved the letter again. Rereading it, she noticed a sentence she had skimmed before. Alice was the mirror we were all too afraid to look into. What did that mean? Was she a reflection of what Lydia could have been, or what she had once tried to hide? In another photograph, Alice was laughing, holding a young Lydia's hand near what looked like a boarding school's stone gate. They looked inseparable. Eleanor zoomed in on the building in the background and, using a search engine, identified it as Marigold Hall, an old finishing school outside Bristol. The school had long since closed, but newspaper clippings online mentioned a scandal in 1959 involving a missing student. The student's name was redacted. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Was it Alice? Was she the girl who disappeared? Why had Lydia preserved these photographs so carefully yet kept them locked away? The attic wasn't just a place of nostalgia. It was a vault for a story never told. Eleanor realized then that Alice wasn't just part of her grandmother's past. She was the secret that haunted generations. The next morning, Eleanor booked a train to Bristol. The truth wasn't going to come find her. She had to go and drag it into the light herself. As the train ticket confirmation hit her inbox, she felt a chill run through her, not from fear but from resolve. The woman in the photographs had been hidden too long. Eleanor was done looking away. Alice had a story, and it was time someone finally listened. The train to Bristol moved steadily through the English countryside, its rhythmic hum offering a strange sense of comfort as Eleanor stared out the window, clutching a folder filled with copied photographs and Lydia's letter. She had spent the night researching Marigold Hall, what little was still accessible online, and uncovered hints of controversy, hushed-up incidents, and the school's eventual closure in the early 60s. Most of the sources had been scrubbed, with only scattered references left behind in obscure message boards and archived regional newspapers. The deeper Eleanor dug, the more it became clear. Something had happened at that school, something serious enough for a woman like Lydia to dedicate her life to burying it. When the train arrived, Eleanor stepped out into crisp morning air, her breath visible in the chill, the town of Bristol stretching before her with a quiet grace. She took a cab to the last known address of Marigold Hall, but found only ruins. The building had burned down over a decade ago, leaving behind a skeletal frame of stone and ivy. A weathered sign barely hung from one hinge, and graffiti lined the charred bricks. Still, Eleanor stepped through the rusted gate, her boots crunching over broken glass and old leaves. As she wandered through the remnants of the courtyard, she tried to imagine the girls who once laughed here, walked these paths, shared secrets under the arches. Somewhere in these halls, Lydia and Alice had lived out a chapter of their lives that had changed everything. She found the remnants of a stairwell and followed it to what once must have been the library. There, between crumbling shelves and scorched walls, she discovered something unexpected. A metal filing cabinet, surprisingly intact. Most drawers were rusted shut, but one opened with a groan, revealing a stack of brittle documents, many half-burned but some legible. School reports, incident logs, names. Eleanor flipped through them, heart racing, until she found it. A Lockwood. Transferred under special guardianship, 1957. Withdrawn by family. Classified incident, March 1959. Lockwood. Alice Lockwood. Her hands trembled. She kept digging. Beneath the stack of papers, folded carefully and wrapped in an old silk scarf, was a leather-bound diary. It wasn't labeled, but inside the front cover were the initials Yell. Eleanor sat down on a stone bench, brushing dust from the pages. The handwriting was neat, expressive, unafraid. Alice's voice emerged like a candle in the dark. March 3, 1958. Lydia and I snuck out again. The tunnels behind the chapel aren't just stories. There's something down there. Something real. We shouldn't have gone in, but I can't stop thinking about it. There's a door. It wasn't locked. Eleanor blinked. Tunnels? A chapel? She read further. March 17th. I told Lydia what I saw. She doesn't believe me, or she pretends not to. I think they made her forget. Headmistress said I was hysterical. Gave me pills. But I know what I saw. I know who I saw. The entries grew more erratic, more urgent. Mentions of voices in the walls. Of photographs that were taken and confiscated. Of Lydia becoming cold, distant. And then finally, April 6th. If anything happens to me, tell the truth. Don't let them erase me. Eleanor closed the diary slowly, her mind spinning. Whatever had happened here, Alice had tried to preserve it. She looked back at the building, its bones blackened and bowed, but in her mind, it began to take shape again. The chapel, the tunnels, the hush of secrets kept beneath pressed uniforms and polished shoes. Eleanor left the ruins with the diary tucked inside her coat, the photograph safe in her bag. She felt like she was carrying echoes. Echoes of a girl who had screamed into silence. That evening, she found a local librarian willing to speak. The woman, Mrs. Hargrave, was in her 70s and had once taught piano lessons at Marigold Hall. At the mention of Alice Lockwood, her eyes darkened. "Alice," she murmured. "Bright girl. Too bright. That school wasn't kind to girls like her. Lydia was her closest friend. More than that, maybe. But something changed them both." Eleanor pressed gently. "What happened in March of 1959? Mrs. Hargrave's hands folded tightly in her lap. "There was an accident," she whispered. "Or so they said. Alice vanished. They claimed her family took her. But no one ever saw her again." Eleanor thanked the woman and stepped out into the fading light, her breath catching in her throat. She knew now that Alice hadn't been forgotten. She had been erased. The fire, the files, the silence, it had all been intentional. And yet here Alice was, speaking again through pages and photographs. Eleanor felt the weight of the secret pressing harder. No longer a whisper but a demand. She looked down at the photo of Lydia and Alice by the chapel gates and made a silent vow. Whatever had happened in those tunnels, she would find it. She owed Alice that much. She owed herself the truth. "Let me know when you're ready for key point 4. Eleanor returned to the ruins of Marigold Hall the next morning, this time prepared. She brought gloves, a flashlight, and a printed blueprint of the original school layout she'd found on an archival architecture site. The map confirmed it. Beneath the chapel once stood a network of maintenance tunnels, originally built as bomb shelters during the war. Her breath came out in puffs as she walked toward the chapel's remains. Its once beautiful facade now a gaping skeleton of ash and brick. Vines coiled like veins across its walls, and moss had begun to reclaim the stone. But the arched entryway still stood, solemn and watchful. Inside, the floor was cracked open in several places, stone tiles caved in, exposing sections of the earth beneath. Eleanor traced the outline on her blueprint with her finger, then measured her steps from the front door, counting silently. She reached the pulpit, then turned left, brushing past a broken pew. And there, beneath a half-rotted floorboard, she found it, a metal ring embedded in the ground. She grasped it with both hands and pulled. The hatch resisted at first, but then gave with a groan, revealing a square opening and an iron ladder leading down into darkness. Eleanor hesitated. The tunnel yawned below her like an open mouth. But she had come too far to stop now. One rung at a time, she descended, the cold climbing her skin like a second shadow. The tunnel smelled of damp stone, rust, and something else, earthy and ancient, like the breath of time itself. Her flashlight flickered slightly, and she tightened her grip, heart pounding. The space beneath the chapel was narrow, barely wide enough for her shoulders, and the ceiling was low, forcing her to crouch. Pipes ran along the walls, some snapped, others intact but groaning faintly with residual pressure. She walked for what felt like miles, deeper and deeper into the labyrinth. Then she saw it, a wooden door, warped but intact, with an iron handle. Just as Alice had written. Eleanor reached for it. The handle was freezing, but it turned easily. The door creaked open to reveal a small room, carved into the stone like a secret chamber. And there, on the far wall, were photographs. Dozens of them. Pinned with rusted nails and curling at the edges, the photographs showed girls, students from Marigold Hall, in various states of distress. Some were crying, some had bandages on their wrists, some stared straight at the camera with eyes wide and hollow. Eleanor's skin prickled. These weren't memories. They were warnings. In the center of the wall, under a cracked glass frame, was a final photograph. Alice and Lydia, side by side, arms around each other, faces flushed with youth. Someone had written in red ink across the bottom. Only one came out. Beneath it, A journal rested on a wooden crate. Eleanor picked it up, flipping through pages that chronicled experiments, emotional breakdowns, punishments. The entries weren't Alice's. They were written by someone else, someone who worked at the school. Subject: EL exhibits lucid recall of unauthorized memory sequences. Isolation recommended. Observation to continue under chapel wing. The date matched the week Alice had gone missing. Eleanor's stomach turned. This wasn't just a school secret. It was institutional abuse. The tunnels had been used for confinement, for erasing girls who didn't conform, girls who questioned, girls who remembered, girls like Alice. Eleanor took pictures of everything, her hands shaking, the air thick with mold and memory. On the floor beneath the crate, something caught her eye, a silver locket, dusty and forgotten. She picked it up and opened it. Inside were two tiny portraits. One of Alice. One of Lydia. The truth hit Eleanor like a tidal wave. They had loved each other. Not as friends. Not as sisters. But as something deeper, forbidden in their time. And someone had discovered them. That's why Alice had been erased. Not just because of what she saw, but because of who she loved. The church, the school, even Lydia's silence. It all made sense now. Eleanor closed the locket and tucked it into her coat pocket. The walls around her no longer felt like stone. They felt like witnesses. The sound of a pebble skittering behind her made her whip around. Heart hammering, but there was nothing there. Just shadows. Still, she knew she wasn't welcome. She climbed back up the ladder, daylight slicing through the hatch above like salvation. She emerged coughing, gasping the air like she'd been underwater. Her hands were blackened with dust, her cheeks tear-streaked, her mind reeling. She knew now why Lydia had sealed everything away. Shame. Protection. Fear. But secrets never stay buried. They rot, they fester, and eventually, they claw their way into the light. Eleanor looked down at her hands, at the photographs, at the locket. She had unearthed more than history. She had resurrected a voice. A love. A truth too heavy for the world Lydia had lived in. But not for Eleanor's. She would tell their story. The world would finally know who Alice Lockwood was. And Lydia Whitmore, her grandmother, would no longer be the woman who stayed silent, but the one who had loved too deeply to survive in a world of repression. Eleanor felt the beginning of resolve bloom in her chest. This was only the halfway point. The next step was returning home and deciding how to confront the legacy that had shaped her family for generations. Eleanor returned home 3 days later with dirt under her fingernails, her grandmother's locket resting like a hidden heartbeat beneath her shirt, and her suitcase heavy with photographs, copied records, and Alice's diary. Her mother, Patricia, opened the door in silence, her expression unreadable. The house felt smaller than before, as if Eleanor had grown larger through her discoveries, too large to fit within the tidy lies passed down like heirlooms. They stood across from each other in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound between them. Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a photo, one of Patricia as a child standing beside Alice. "You knew her," Eleanor said quietly, placing the photo on the counter like a playing card in a game neither had wanted to start. Patricia didn't look down. She closed her eyes instead, took a deep breath, and sat down slowly at the table. "She was my mother," she whispered. The words detonated in Eleanor's mind, sending fragments of her understanding shattering in all directions. "Wait, you mean Alice?" Patricia nodded. "Lydia raised me. But Alice gave birth to me." The world tilted slightly. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Eleanor asked, her voice cracking. "Because I didn't know until I was 17, Patricia replied, her gaze distant. "Lydia finally told me the truth, after Alice had already vanished. She said it was to protect me. From scandal, from shame, from the pain of losing a mother who never got to be one." Eleanor sat across from her, stunned. Did she really vanish? Patricia's mouth twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. She didn't run away. They took her. The school, the church, whoever was behind that place. Lydia said Alice was going to be corrected, whatever that meant. But she never came home. Eleanor reached into her bag again and pulled out the diary. She didn't disappear. She was locked beneath the chapel. She left a record. She handed the book to her mother, who took it like a sacred object, hands trembling. Patricia flipped through a few pages, reading her mother's voice for the first time. Tears filled her eyes but didn't fall. She was so young, Patricia murmured. They were both so young. Eleanor placed the locket on the table next. She carried Lydia with her, even down there. They loved each other, didn't they? Patricia nodded. More than anything. But they weren't allowed to. It was 1959. Two girls caught kissing behind the chapel. It wasn't just scandal, it was dangerous. The silence that followed was dense, but not hollow. It was filled with the gravity of truth, newly unearthed. Eleanor thought about the generations of women in her family, all shaped by a lie born of survival. Why didn't Lydia tell me? She asked softly. She was ashamed, Patricia said. Not of Alice. Of herself. Of not fighting harder. Of letting the world silence her. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, staring up at the ceiling as though it could offer answers. We have to tell this story, she said. To the family. To everyone. She deserves to be remembered. Patricia hesitated. What good will that do now? It won't bring her back, Eleanor said. But it might bring her peace. And us too. Her mother looked down at the diary again, nodding slowly. All right. But we do it right. Carefully. With her voice leading the way. Over the next few days, they compiled everything. Photographs scanned, diary entries typed, school records cited. Eleanor contacted a journalist she knew from university. A woman who specialized in lost histories and institutional cover-ups. The woman, intrigued, agreed to meet. That evening, Eleanor sat alone in the living room, holding the locket, the soft metal warmed by her skin. She opened it again and stared at the two tiny portraits. She tried to imagine Alice's voice. What she would say now. What she would think of a world that had finally started listening to stories like hers. Eleanor hoped she'd be proud. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Some in the family would resist, others would deny. But the truth had its own momentum. Once freed, it didn't go back into the dark. That night, Patricia and Eleanor sat side by side, reading aloud from Alice's diary by candlelight. They read the words she had once written in fear, now spoken in reverence. The house felt different as they read, less haunted, more alive. As if Lydia and Alice were there listening, forgiving. Eleanor looked at her mother and thought. We were broken by silence. We will be healed by story. She didn't know what the world would do with Alice's truth, but she knew she'd do everything in her power to make sure it was heard. And for the first time since opening that attic door, she felt something close to peace. The article went live on a rainy Thursday morning. It was titled, Buried Beneath the Chapel, The Forgotten Voices of Marigold Hall, and within minutes it began to spread like wildfire. Eleanor and Patricia sat together on the couch, a blanket draped across their laps, watching as the first wave of comments, shares, and emails flooded in. The piece was masterfully written, sensitive yet piercing, weaving Alice's diary entries with Eleanor's photographs, school records, and eyewitness testimony from Mrs. Hargrave. It spoke of love criminalized, of institutions that silenced women, and of the legacy that such silence leaves behind. Within the first hour, the article had reached 10,000 reads. By lunchtime, it had crossed 100,000. And by evening, it was on the front page of national news sites. Eleanor's inbox was a storm. Messages from descendants of Marigold Hall students, from activists, from educators, from people who had never known Alice but now mourned her like family. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. One email came from a retired nurse who remembered seeing a girl matching Alice's description in a private facility in Northumberland in 1960, mute, withdrawn, called only Patient 7. Another came from a former priest who had long left the church, confessing that he'd overheard administrators speaking of corrective wards for girls who deviated. But most of the messages were simple, heartfelt. Thank you for telling her story. My aunt was sent to a place like this. She never came home. We see her now. We remember. Eleanor read every message aloud to Patricia. They cried. They laughed. They sat in silence when words were not enough. The journalist, Maya Keller, called later that night. We need to go deeper, she said. People are opening up. This isn't just Alice's story. There are dozens, maybe hundreds, like hers. Eleanor agreed. It had never been about one secret, one family. It was about a pattern of erasure, repeated across time, hidden behind closed doors and polite reputations. Maya proposed a follow-up feature, a podcast episode, even a documentary. Eleanor hesitated at first. The story was so intimate, so personal. But then she thought of Alice's diary, the final entry, the plea. Tell the truth. Don't let them erase me. And she said yes. Over the next week, their quiet home turned into a storm of energy and purpose. Interview schedules were drawn up. Copies of the photographs were archived. Maya visited with a small crew, filming Eleanor and Patricia in their garden, telling Alice's story under the dappled light of early spring. In one scene, Patricia read from her mother's diary with tears streaming down her cheeks. In another, Eleanor walked through the old cemetery where they believed Alice might be buried. Unmarked, unnamed. Public outcry pushed local authorities to finally investigate the ruins of Marigold Hall. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Ground-penetrating radar scans were ordered. They didn't find Alice. But they found others, 3 skeletons in the chapel tunnels, dating back to the late 1950s. Official statements were cautious, but privately, one officer told Eleanor. It wasn't just a school. It was a place people were sent to disappear. Within a month, the bishop of the diocese that had once overseen Marigold Hall released a formal apology. Survivors were invited to share testimony. A memorial fund was established for affected families. And still the story spread. A theater company approached Eleanor, asking permission to adapt the diary into a play. A university offered her a grant to speak on suppressed queer histories in academic institutions. A publisher reached out to propose a book. Eleanor said yes to all of it. Because this wasn't just about the past. It was about how we choose to live with it. To speak it. To honor it. Late one night, Patricia came into Eleanor's room holding a box she hadn't seen before. It was Lydia's, she said. I couldn't open it until now. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written by Alice and never sent. Letters to Lydia, to Patricia, to a future child she hoped to meet someday. Eleanor held them with reverence, her eyes catching on one envelope marked for my granddaughter. Should I ever meet her? With trembling hands she opened it. The letter was gentle, filled with longing. Alice had imagined her grandchild with curious eyes and a bright mind. If you find this, she wrote, then I believe I am finally seen. Eleanor clutched the paper to her chest. The moment was almost too big to carry. But she carried it anyway. Because some stories don't end. They echo. They bloom. The house was quiet in the days following the publication storm. A kind of sacred hush settling over the walls, as if the past itself were catching its breath. Eleanor wandered through the old rooms with a new kind of reverence. Each floorboard creak and sunlight-dappled window a reminder of what had finally been uncovered. On the third morning after the article went viral, she ventured back into the attic, not to chase ghosts, but to thank them. It was no longer a place of secrecy and silence. It had become a sanctuary, a chapel of remembrance. She moved with care, brushing aside cobwebs and opening trunks she'd previously ignored, not looking for answers, but for traces. Artifacts of a life lived in shadow. Near the bottom of one battered trunk, beneath an old military coat and a folded quilt, she found a wooden box she hadn't noticed before. It was small, sealed with a rusted latch, and carved with the initials LW. Her heart stuttered. Lydia Whitmore. With shaking hands, Eleanor pried the latch open. Inside, nestled between silk handkerchiefs and a dried lavender sprig, was an envelope yellowed with time and sealed in wax. The handwriting on the front read, "To Eleanor when you're ready." The wax cracked as she broke the seal, and the parchment unfolded with a sigh of age. Her grandmother's handwriting, graceful and deliberate, spilled across the page. "My darling girl," it began. "If you are reading this, then you've found the photographs, and likely much more. I've spent a lifetime trying to forget what I should have protected. I loved Alice more than I was ever allowed to admit. I loved her with a clarity that frightened me. And when they came for her, I let them. I didn't stop them. I froze. I obeyed. And I have lived every day since with the weight of that silence." Eleanor's throat closed. "They told me she'd be cared for. Corrected. But deep down I knew. I knew the minute I signed that paper that I was trading her soul for my survival. I was 19. Terrified. Trapped. But that is no excuse. I lost her that day. And I lost myself too." The letter grew shakier as it went on. "When your mother was born, they gave her to me. Told me Alice had renounced all rights. I raised Patricia as best I could, trying to smother my grief with duty. I never told her the truth until she was old enough to leave me. I didn't want her to grow up in the shadow of pain. But pain has a way of clinging, even when unspoken." Eleanor wiped tears from her cheeks, her breath catching on the page. "I've kept Alice alive in the only way I knew how, through the photographs. Each one a refusal to forget. A rebellion. But I was a coward, Eleanor. You, my fierce, brilliant girl. You are the one with courage. You did what I never could. You brought her back." The letter closed simply. "If there is a next life, I hope Alice will forgive me. And I hope you will too. With all the love I never learned how to show, Grandma Lydia." Eleanor folded the letter and held it against her heart, sobbing quietly into the attic air that now felt like her grandmother's embrace. She stayed there for hours, rereading it again and again, memorizing every curve of ink, every pause between words. That night, she framed the letter and placed it on the mantel beside Alice's diary, and a copy of the published article. The three women, Alice, Lydia, and Patricia, were finally reunited, their stories interwoven, their truths no longer denied. In the quiet of the living room, Eleanor lit a candle and whispered aloud, "She forgives you. I do too." And somehow, in the flicker of that flame, in the hush that followed, she believed Lydia heard her. The house felt warmer, lighter, like it, too, had been waiting to exhale. Spring came late that year, with daffodils blooming along the edge of the Whitmore garden like shy witnesses to a long-awaited conversation. The once silent house had begun to hum again, no longer with secrets, but with the sound of renewal. Eleanor and Patricia decided the time had come to share Alice's story not just with the world, but with the family. It wasn't an easy choice. Some cousins had grown up steeped in denial, in carefully edited stories passed down through generations, each gap masked as tradition. Others had their own ghosts to protect. But Eleanor refused to let silence take root again. She drafted invitations by hand, careful and sincere, and sent them to every living Whitmore. "Please come. There's something you deserve to know. Something beautiful, heartbreaking, and real." She didn't mention Alice or Lydia. She let the gravity of mystery do its work. And to her surprise, nearly all of them responded. On the first Sunday of April, they arrived, distant cousins from Devon, great-aunts from Cornwall, nieces and nephews Eleanor had barely known. The house brimmed with life, with cautious greetings, lingering glances, and plates of food no one quite felt like eating. Eleanor waited until they'd all settled, then stood in the center of the room holding a single photograph. Alice smiling beneath the wisteria, Lydia's hand tucked gently in hers. She began to speak, not from a script, not from the article, but from her heart. She told them about the attic, the letter, the photographs, the diary, the tunnels. She told them about a school that punished love and a world that called care a sin. And she told them about Alice, the mother Patricia had never known, the great-aunt none of them had ever heard of. She wasn't a ghost, Eleanor said. She was erased. But we're here now. And we're remembering. At first there was silence, the kind that felt like judgment. But then an aunt, Ruth from the Welsh side, spoke. I remember my mother whispering about a scandal. A girl who vanished. I always thought it was a myth. Another cousin added. My father went to school near Marigold. He once said it was cursed. Maybe it wasn't the place. It was what they did to girls like her. The dam began to break. People shared stories, half-memories, fragments they hadn't realized were part of a larger whole. Patricia stepped forward and read from one of Alice's unsent letters. Her voice didn't shake. She read as a daughter finally speaking with her mother. When she finished, no one clapped. No one needed to. There were tears. There were embraces. There was silence that held space, not shame. At the end of the night, Eleanor guided them into the backyard where she had prepared a makeshift memorial. A tree planted in Alice's name, surrounded by small wooden plaques etched with the words. She was loved. She was here. One by one, the family placed photographs, letters, and tokens at its base. Someone played a song from the late 1950s on their phone, and the garden became a space between time, between grief and joy, memory and hope. As dusk deepened, lanterns were lit, casting gentle light on faces both young and old. Eleanor stood beneath the tree, looking at her family, fractured, yes, but mending. They hadn't all agreed. Some had left early, too uncomfortable to stay. But most remained, not because they fully understood, but because they wanted to try. That night, Eleanor wrote in her journal, they showed up. They listened. That's all I ever wanted for Alice. She dreamed of the garden, of Lydia and Alice walking hand in hand through rows of wildflowers, no longer hiding. The wind whispered their names. The house at last felt full, not of secrets, but of story. Days turned into weeks, and while the world continued to read and retell Alice Lockwood's story, one question remained unanswered. Where was she laid to rest? Eleanor couldn't shake the need to know. Her grandmother's letter had spoken of regret, of love, of silence, but not of Alice's final moments. No diary entry revealed a burial site. No record mentioned a grave. It was as if Alice had vanished into the air beneath the chapel, leaving only echoes behind. But Eleanor believed differently. Someone had to know. Someone had to remember. With Patricia's blessing, she launched a formal request with the diocese archives, citing the journalistic investigation and public attention. Bureaucracy was slow. The request passed through 3 departments before someone named Mr. Alden called her directly. There's something odd, he said. A ledger from 1961 handwritten, no official seal. It lists a burial, female unnamed, coordinates referencing the St. Elspeth's Cemetery in Northumberland. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Does it mention any initials? Cause of death. Just one word, he replied. Wayward. The term struck Eleanor like lightning. Alice's diary had used it once. They called me wayward when I spoke the truth. With renewed purpose, Eleanor booked a trip to Northumberland. She and Patricia arrived on a misty morning, the hills rolling out like a memory. The cemetery was old, tucked behind a weather-worn chapel, gravestones crooked and moss-covered, the air thick with solemnity. They followed Mr. Alden's directions down the southern edge of the property, where unmarked graves lay in rows. No headstones, just indentations in the earth and worn tags half swallowed by the soil. Eleanor walked slowly, eyes scanning the ground. Patricia followed in silence, one hand on her daughter's shoulder. Then near the base of an old oak tree, Eleanor stopped. A rusted iron tag hung from a short stake. The engraving was almost gone, but under the right light she could just make out F7/Wayward. Her breath hitched. Patricia knelt beside it, gently brushing away the leaves, the dirt. It's her, she whispered. It has to be. The cemetery keeper approached quietly, cap in hand. No records on that one, he said. But I've worked here 30 years. Locals say that rose for girls from the asylum down the road. Girls with no kin. No name. Eleanor looked at him, her voice firm. She had both. Her name was Alice Lockwood. She was a daughter, a mother, and someone loved her. The man nodded, a quiet respect passing between them. That afternoon, Eleanor and Patricia returned with a wooden marker, hand-carved with Alice's name, birth year, and the simple inscription, "You are seen. You are loved. You are free." They planted daffodils around it, Alice's favorite flower, according to one of Lydia's letters, and lit a single candle in the still air. Patricia knelt and placed her hand on the soil. "I'm sorry I didn't know you. But I carry you now," she whispered. Eleanor added, "We'll tell them where you are. You're not forgotten." Before they left, Eleanor used her phone to pin the exact coordinates. She uploaded them to the memorial website created after the article and shared the update with Maya, the journalist. The next day, a post went viral. "Alice Lockwood has been found." Messages poured in. Families with similar stories asked for help identifying their lost. Universities began citing Alice's story in lectures. The cemetery reported visitors leaving flowers at her grave. A movement had begun, not just to remember, but to recover. Eleanor stood at the edge of the field one last time before leaving, watching the wind ripple through the grass, and she swore she felt a presence, gentle, watching, finally at rest. She turned to her mother, who took her hand. "Let's go home," Patricia said. And this time they both knew what that meant. 6 months later, the Whitmore house had changed in subtle but profound ways. The attic was no longer locked. It had been turned into a small archive and reading space, where Alice's diary and Lydia's letter were displayed in a glass case alongside digital prints of the original photographs. The walls held framed images of both women, and Eleanor often found herself climbing the steps just to sit there, to think, to listen. People visited now. Journalists, students, historians, even strangers who had read the story and come to pay their respects. A plaque outside the house read, "Whitmore Archive for Hidden Histories, in memory of Alice Lockwood and Lydia Whitmore." Eleanor ran it part-time with Maya Keller, the journalist who had first brought the story to light. Together, they launched a podcast, Unburied, which explored stories of forgotten lives and suppressed truths. The first season was entirely dedicated to Marigold Hall, its students, its ghosts, and the power of remembrance. Eleanor hosted it with grace and clarity, her voice steady but never detached. Listeners across the world tuned in. Messages came from countries she'd never visited. Young women who had felt unseen, queer elders who had never spoken of their first loves, and descendants of other wayward girls whose stories had been lost to history. In one episode, Patricia joined as a guest, reading from Alice's letters and recounting what it meant to learn, so late, who her mother really was. It became the most downloaded episode that season. Universities invited Eleanor to speak. Her talks weren't academic lectures, they were emotional journeys. She showed photographs, read diary passages, and talked about what silence costs when it passes from one generation to the next. One university even offered her an honorary fellowship in historical recovery and social memory. She declined the title but accepted the collaboration. "This isn't just history," she said during her acceptance speech. "It's healing. It's a living thing. And we all have a duty to tend it." At home, life grew quieter again, but not empty. Eleanor returned to painting, her canvases now filled with silhouettes and shadows wrapped in gold and violet hues. Art inspired by memory, by ghosts made visible. One piece, The Chapel Door, won a regional art award and was displayed in a traveling exhibition. It showed a young woman standing at the edge of a broken threshold, one hand on the door, light streaming from the crack like a promise. Patricia, too, found transformation. She started volunteering at a local support center for adopted children and birth parents reuniting after decades apart. "I can't give Alice a life," she once said, "but I can help someone else hold on to theirs." Every year on the anniversary of Alice's discovery, they traveled to Northumberland. They tended the grave, replanted the daffodils, replaced the wood marker when it weathered. One year, they were joined by 3 other families, strangers once, now connected by history's threads. Each had found someone of their own. They stood together under gray skies, hands clasped, grief and joy braided into something sacred. A stone bench now sat beneath the oak, engraved with words Eleanor had chosen. To those once erased, your story lives. In the end, the story didn't end. It rippled outward. It changed people. It stitched up wounds no one had dared name. Eleanor sometimes stood before the photographs and whispered thanks, not just to Alice and Lydia, but to her younger self, the one who hadn't looked away. And on one particular morning, just as the first frost glazed the garden, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from a girl named Mary Ann in Boston, 17 years old, who wrote, "Because of Alice, I came out to my parents last week. And they held me." Eleanor read it twice, her heart swelling. She folded the letter, placed it in the archive under Alice's portrait, and smiled. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. Somewhere it carried Alice's name, no longer forgotten, only remembered, only loved. Thank you for diving into our incredible stories. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more adventures. This is just the beginning. There's so much more to come.